this episode of the wrap up is about horror, so we should talk a little bit about content warnings. We are going to be talking about the horror genre. We're going to be talking about a variety of, horror games, horror movies, horror media in general, and things that can inspire horror. So I would say we have a blanket content warning for things that you would see in the horror, genre. This could range from one of my favorites, body horror, to psychological horror, to the kinds of horrific themes that resonate with the current times, like the movie Get Out, are all things that we will be discussing. That said, this stream is also going to be a little bit shorter. I have to get to a charity D&D game, so we're gonna end at 8:30 Eastern. We've all had a long week, and this is a heavy topic, so I'm actually pretty grateful that we decided to do a shorter stream today. But yeah, we're gonna be talking about horror. But yeah, back to this pandemic thing. I found myself engaging more with the horror genre during this pandemic. I Having read that article, I certainly feel like one of the individuals who was psychologically prepared for what's going on. I grew up in a family and my parents are preppers, and I learned that sort of stuff, and I was prepared for this. That's also the kind of fiction that I really enjoy reading. And so when the pandemic happened, certainly there are feelings of, grief for what's happening and empathy for those who are not doing as well or were not as prepared. But for my own well-being, I was able to engage in, the horror genre more during this pandemic, because it allowed me to kind of think about how I was feeling and kind of think about, I think horror is really interesting because, and especially horror games, because it's a genre that lets you explore that darkness that we all have inside of ourselves. And I think that's why horror games, particularly those of the TTRPG nature or the analog nature, are really special. And that's what we're going to be talking about because it's Friday, and welcome to the wrap up. I'm Daniel. I'm joined by my co-hosts on this side, Steve and Agatha, and Jeremy. Jeremy,
And dog will say hi.
Oh,
Hello.
Ed Dog.
Hello. She's being a little horror right now.
Oh.
Precious. So my girlfriend's packing outside and she wants to run out and chew everything, including the suitcase.
I guess we'll have to deal with the dog on stream. Jeremy,
Yeah.
I was really excited for you to be on this stream, in part because, as I've gotten to know you more during this pandemic and all of the work we've been doing together, I'm like, Jeremy and I have so much in common.
We both have an affinity for Leon Kennedy, and I'm
Oh,
still willing to kickstart your Resident Evil 4 home movie from high school?
oh yeah, I forgot. I forgot I talked about that.
Yeah.
um,
I'm just imagining Daniel Kwan in a leather jacket, with a suitcase that
and
contains all of
it's
his firepower.
it's my attaché case.
Yeah, your attaché case.
I I I'm super jealous because you got that unofficial you kickstarted that unofficial history of Resident Evil book, right?
Yes, Itchy Tasty, Unofficial History of Resident Evil, written by an Asian dude. His name escapes me right now, because I actually haven't started reading it. But yeah, I didn't kickstart it. I backed it on Unbound. It's a history
Oh,
of the
okay.
franchise, and I really recommend it. I flipped through it. I'm probably going to try to read it in the week before Village comes out, but he's in Japan. He talked with developers, talked with the evolution of the series from even before Resident Evil 1, talked about Sweet Home, which was the NES game that kind of inspired Resident Evil. So it's a great read.
Yeah, I'm really envious that you have that because I was looking at it online and I was like, no, I'm not gonna get this. And then after you posted about it, I think you tweeted about it. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, Jeremy's getting it. And then I went to look and it's months before anyone else can get it.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'm envious. It's on my Amazon wish list. Or
But,
yeah.
but yeah, I actually I quite like horror. It's probably as far as genre fiction goes, like fantasy is up here, horror is here, and sci-fi I actually like probably the least. But the interesting thing is that for like so much of my life, I was terrified of horror. I very much avoided horror. I went through a period as a kid where I was scared to death of vampires. I think it was because I spent too many times just wandering through the horror section in Blockbuster,
Yeah.
which was always next to like the kids section, I think, and in the Blockbuster that I grew up in. And I would always just find myself wandering along these VHS tapes of like killer clowns and vampires and stuff like that. And I remember one specific poster showing like, I don't know, like Dracula with fangs just freaked me out. And that image stuck with me as a kid. And I remember I couldn't sleep. And for a long time after that, I just avoided the horror genre. I avoided horror games. I avoided horror movies. Um, Yet there was always this weird sort of, I guess, attraction at the same time. I was a kid scared by the Blockbuster shelves, but at the same time, I was the one that wandered through them. And I guess it's that sort of duality between being intrigued by kind of this dark subject matter, but also being frightened of it, that is so fascinating about horror to me. And then eventually, as an adult, I got really into horror because in 2014, I went through a really bad breakup. And in order to make myself, well, to shake myself out of the funk that I was in, I decided to read It by Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I don't feel like drowning my sorrows in sad songs or like romantic movies. I'm going to read a horror book. And I figured that a book was safe because I had more control over the flow of the narrative in the pages. So I dove into Stephen King. I got really into Stephen King, and I did get over my breakup, but at the same time, I learned this appreciation for horror.
Yeah, it's what's interesting that you say you went fantasy, horror, and then sci-fi, but horror is one of those. I mean, all of those genres can kind of blend together and
Yeah, but horror can
overlap.
blend a lot. I was speaking in very general terms, but
Yeah,
as we were talking about prior to the stream, horror is it can really mesh itself with any of those
yeah.
genres.
I've always been, for as long as I can remember, been fascinated with. I wouldn't say horror, and I would say the weird.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because I grew up around museums all the time. Like that tradition of the cabinet of curiosity, seeing, animals in jars. Like that stuff is just, it gets me going. And I loved it so much. And I remember, we were talking about my love of Leon Kennedy. I remember playing Resident Evil 4 on the GameCube, and that game clicking on every level with me. It had the action that like I grew up watching in like, Jackie Chan and Jet Li movies growing up and all of like the Shaw Brothers stuff. But it also had like that weird horror that I also really loved from sort of like my museum upbringing and the kinds of stuff I liked to do in D&D.
It's also pretty funny. Like Leon
And
Kennedy's suplexing
oh,
cultists, like
suplexing guys and smashing
it's
their heads.
ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So it's like Resident Evil 4 for me is like kind of this weird nexus of everything that I love because it was like action, comedy, body horror, and then Ashley.
Mm-hmm.
um, but like
Hang on, Ashley, I'm coming for
Ashley,
you.
Leon.
Yeah.
But like in preparation for this stream, I was thinking of like the first question that I wanted to ask everyone. And it kind of came down to exactly what we're talking about. What is horror? And what is horror to each of us? And what kind of horror do we enjoy? So I couldn't really settle on one question. And it was instead like a series of questions.
Yeah.
Right? Like what is horror to you and what kind of horror do you enjoy? Right? Jeremy, you mentioned It. And that's the kind of horror I don't like.
Interesting.
Because I hate clowns.
Mm.
I have I think Agatha already knows this. I have like a strong dislike of clowns and old dolls. So the Chucky films and It, I just never touched because I just don't do clowns.
I can understand that. Yeah.
But, I love zombie movies. I love, paranormal investigation movies.
See, I actually find zombies to be quite uninteresting, except for Resident Evil. I like them in Resident Evil, but for very specific reasons. I find the idea of a zombie apocalypse, as it's been popularized by like The Walking Dead, and as you often see it, to be kind of overplayed in my opinion. I prefer the idea of zombies just coexisting in the regular world, which is what Resident Evil does, and used as, biohazard weapons.
But that's
You
when
know,
you could find, I think, the best. When we talk about the best zombie movies, we talk about movies that kind of explore the story
Right.
beyond the apocalypse, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think one of the best zombie movies ever made is Wreck, the Spanish zombie movie.
I haven't seen it.
So Wreck, there are four movies. It was a Spanish series of found footage movies, except for the third one. It was actually remade in America with Jennifer Carpenter, and it was called Quarantine. Don't watch that movie; it's awful. But Wreck actually follows this like early morning news anchor, and she's kind of embedded with a firefighter house, and she's kind of following around the daily routine of these firefighters, and they end up going to this apartment on a call, and her camera crew's there the entire time, and then things just go to shit. It is one of the best zombie movies I've ever watched. One of the few zombie movies that has genuinely scared me, and I think one of the most creative takes on the zombie genre. And I think it is, and if you loved Resident Evil 7, you will see exactly where they got their influence in the first Wreck movie.
one more thing I want to add, Jeremy. Literally, not literally, but like probably 6 months ago, I had a conversation with someone who hates zombie movies, or doesn't hate them, but like finds them quite boring.
Mhm.
And what I did was I kind of took them on a journey of like deconstructing the horror of it and like what the horror actually means. Because
Oh yeah, that I find interesting.
yeah. So what I did,
the ideas behind the zombie are great.
yeah. So when I was like, hey, I think this is why zombies resonate with other people,
Mhm.
and like this is the horror they're trying to engage with. They were like, huh, and then went back and they didn't love The Walking Dead, for example, but
Mhm.
they were like, I definitely have a respect for it, and like
Yeah.
I would definitely watch the top 10 episodes of The Walking Dead and like
Yeah,
probably
same.
enjoy them.
Same.
So-
I would, and I think like zombies are a very I've seen them described as like they're kind of like the very kind of like the workmen of the horror genre. Like they sorry, that's my dog yawning and
okay.
making weird noises.
Don't
right now.
apologize.
Don't apologize for your dog.
But they represent a lot, and I love the ideas behind them. I just think it's a lot of times when I've seen them in movies or in games, I just find them to be a little bit like been there, done that. But like once again, I don't mind clowns, and Daniel dislikes clowns, and I think the interesting thing about horror is that there's so many different nuances to all of these things like clowns and zombies and whatever that we can really dive in and investigate.
And I think I want to know about what Agatha, like, I want to know about Agatha's horror tastes. But, like, I wanted to say, like, one thing about the zombie thing while we were on it. And it's, if you look at, like, a really good zombie movie, and then you look at a really, I won't say bad, but different zombie movie, like the Anderson Resident Evil live action movies.
Yeah, I keep thinking of those. Yeah.
Or like, the CG Resident Evil movies, like Vendetta and
those I
Retribution
like.
and all those. I think the thing that doesn't make them as horrific of a horror movie is that for me, the zombies are never really the scary part. It's what people become capable of or feel like they can do and act on when these scenarios happen. So I found the villains in The Walking Dead to be far more scary than the zombies themselves, like Negan. Right. But yeah, Agatha, I want to know about your taste in horror, because we've talked about doing horror stuff here, but we haven't actually done it yet.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this because I don't watch horror films or shows, I guess, because I get scared really easily. But I do feel like I do like horror. I just remember, speaking of like childhood stories of like, what was your first encounter with horror? I discovered this like collection of like Chinese horror stories. And oh my gosh, I was so into it. Like I stayed up late to read through the story. And then I specifically remember that I started reading about the jumping vampire. And then how like, and like that story ended with how, with just like, whenever you hear the sound of like the thumping of someone, like of the vampire, then watch out. And I was like so scared. I like couldn't sleep because I was just like listening to any noise that was outside. I'd be like, oh, is that the vampire? And then I was like, no, it can't be. We're in the 21st century. But yeah, so I remember specifically like loving that thrill of reading it, and then afterwards heavily regretting my decision. And I think since then I haven't really read anything except, but I feel like I do like horror, and the kind of horror that I like is I like gothic horror. Excuse me, specifically like gothic horror as reinterpreted by Japan. So I've read some like mysteries, and then also some mangas specifically that are of the gothic horror tradition. And there's also I do like kind of like the body horror of like, you know, like Junji Ito, that kind of stuff. And I was thinking, like, what is the last thing that really scared me? And it was when I reread Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. I don't know if y'all had to read it. The short story, The Lottery, where it's basically like small town, like social horror, where like you go there and it's just like everything is like nice and stuff, but then people keep talking about this lottery, and then I won't spoil for you, Daniel, what it's like, about.
It's public domain.
Here, I think you could talk about it, then and then just wave, and I'll take my.
I mean,
just go.
Small towns are creepy.
I feel like it's like ruining at this point, like H.P. Lovecraft or things like that. Like, I think you can ruin it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well.
Okay. Anyway.
Anyway, so it doesn't. Either way, I just remember, like, even when I reread it, I was still so drawn in with like this sense of like normality, but then just like the simmering twisted nature of humanity underneath, which is also very much what Stephen King is like.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
I feel like Lovecraft, despite his faults. Yeah.
I've never read Lovecraft.
We would have to do a whole episode on Lovecraft.
Yeah,
like we couldn't just passively mention Lovecraft. Like we would have to do like a whole wrap up, and it would be Lovecraft from an Asian perspective.
Yep. Sure. Write that down. It's Lovecraft and Lovecraft Country.
It's already there. It's already written down.
I'm a big Lovecraft fan who got into him kind of recently, and through the stories and specifically Call of Cthulhu. But yeah, that's there's a lot there. I mean, maybe we'll bring them up a little bit later, but yeah, we should do a deep dive there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like cosmic horror is a very, very popular genre now.
Sorry, Agatha, you were talking about kind of like your take on horror.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think horror to me is like the horror beats in a story, where it's like things that happen that like, and then also fear of the unknown that keep building up the tension until there's like, sometimes there's like a revelation, sometimes there isn't, but it's that, like, it's the evoking of those sensations that is horror to me. And for me, a lot of times I don't like reading supernatural horror, but what I end up reading is like that kind of like thriller is maybe more appropriate because it's not involving the supernatural. I don't know. What do y'all think? Like, I think I know exactly a movie that you would really enjoy, and it's one that I was actually watching before this stream started. It's actually my Zoom background. Like that. Nice.
So this movie came out last year during the pandemic, and I recently found out about it through a friend of mine, Jordan Shively, Dreadsingles on Twitter, and it's called The Empty Man. It is a very long horror movie. It's like over 2 hours long.
Okay, I don't respect that. Sorry.
But hear me out.
I don't respect long movies.
Hear me out. I think it's something that you would enjoy from a storytelling perspective.
Okay.
Don't read any reviews online. but it is a slow burn horror movie where you are not quite sure what it is. It's not a ghost movie. It's not like a cosmic horror movie. Um, but it's a movie that kind of touches on disbelief, small town violence. I really like it. It's got the
Oh, that's
same.
scary.
It's got the same, but because it's so long and it's got a slow burn, it really doesn't rely on the things that many cheap horror movies do, like jump scares.
Right.
It doesn't rely
Right.
on that. It relies on this slow building tension. Uh, I think same vibe. I think you would really like It Follows.
Yeah, I can't actually watch horror. Like once there was we were playing Jaws in our cinema that I was working at, and I wasn't working that day, so I was like, okay, I'm gonna go and watch it. And I walked out within I think the first 10 minutes because I was so stressed.
Yeah.
I almost had an anxiety attack, but I walked out before that happened. So I don't think I can actually.
So I want to talk about this. So this was actually the main topic of this episode is when you're curious about horror, like Agatha, you're like, I like the idea of it. I like these certain themes. I like the gothic horror. I like the Junji Ito, but I don't want to sit down and like passively be scared or told a horror movie that isn't on my terms. That's why I think like horror and TTRPGs is one of the best ways for people to get into the horror genre and find out what they like, right? Because I think the great thing about TTRPGs, whether it be a solo game, because Agatha, you changed my life with these solo games.
You're welcome.
Whether it be like a solo game or like a group game, TTRPGs let you directly explore horror on your terms, right? Since everything is collaborative and your group should be employing things like safety tools, you could slowly explore horrific themes on your terms, which will, of course, let you tailor it to your desires and your limits, which is what I think we should talk about. And it's doing horror in TTRPGs. Like we could just sit here and recommend horror games and horror movies.
Yeah, all day.
All day, right? But I think it's great for us to talk about how people can explore horror themes on their tabletop.
Actually, before that, I did want to know, Steve, what do you like in horror?
Oh yeah, sorry, because Steve
I
was
don't
like
think-
in the conversation, but we never gave Steve spotlight.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I appreciate that. I think horror for me, and this kind of comes from PAX Unplugged, where I sat down for a panel about horror, and unfortunately, the schedule for PAX Unplugged 2019 is gone, so I don't know who was on it. But if you happen to come across this VOD or you're tuned in, I got so much value from it of just talking about horror. And horror for me comes down to the feeling of having control and then losing that control.
Oh.
And that is like the most general way I can describe horror that has really encompassed all of my experiences with anything that everyone has ever like agreed with me, which is the horror genre. But I like that definition because it allows me to talk about horror in such a way that I can see it in other things where you might not see it. So, for example, if you're watching something like Firefly, which by most accounts is not horror, there are moments in it that have like horror elements where you watch it and you're like, oh, I feel like I've lost a little bit of control, or at least the characters have lost control, and I feel empathetic to them. And thus, I also feel a little bit of that loss of control. And I like that because I think if you have that as a more wider base, it allows you kind of see the big picture and allows you more opportunities to be more direct about what flavor of horror you're trying to seek out. And I think, Daniel, that goes to your next point where it's kind of like, like, why do we seek these things out? Like, what is it about horror that like attracts people?
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's interesting because if you watch old horror movies and you compare them to, right now, it's like they're very different and the scares are different. The things that might have been scary when Romero was first making his movies are not scary to us now. One of the things that I think is neat is that, regardless of what the threat is or the theme of the horror movie, what's interesting is that they are written, at least in my opinion, to be reflections of our fears right now, regardless of the setting. Right? That's why, like movies like Get Out were like, there was that layer of added fear. But I'd love to talk about TTRPGs. I have played many games that have had a horror theme, but when looking through my shelves, I only found a couple of games that I thought did horror very well, from a mechanical perspective. I pulled out 5. One of them is on my digital shelf. The ones that I pulled out Mothership, Dread, 10 Candles, and Bluebeard's Bride.
Oh yeah, I have a copy of Bluebeard's Bride that I actually just ordered right here as well.
Ooh. And the last one is actually The Wretched, which Agatha introduced me to. And The Wretched had such a pronounced impact on me that I started writing my own.
Wretched and alone.
Yeah. But I want to know from the rest of you, like, what are some horror analog games, TTRPGs, that you really enjoy? Steve?
No,
Go,
Agatha.
Steve.
Okay, I have one. I just have one.
Go.
I'm only gonna add 10 Candles. I love games that have physical manipulatives that I just love. 10 Candles, anything that has like a weird mechanic, like tea light candles. Like I'm in. But Agatha,
I agree though. Well, sorry, go ahead.
I think also, like, I think there's something like in our like primal brain about having a fire at the table that feels like dangerous, edgy. It has this element of like, who knows what could happen, even though it's a tea light candle and like we know it's going to happen, it's going to burn out. But just even the fantasy of like, well, what if it doesn't? Like, that's very tantalizing for me, and I think that's a very prominent part of horror. But Agatha.
I so agree about the brilliant design of 10 Candles. Even though I never played it, but everyone around me has played it every single year on Halloween. I get like people are like, I'll run it for you, and then our schedules don't work out. But the fact that putting out candles is a part of the mechanics of the game is brilliant, because it is that ritual that of hope flickering out literally as you go. Oh, 10 Candles. So
and
good.
I mean, like, Steve, it lines up perfectly with your own love of like the loss of agency, right? Because
Absolutely.
Candles go, I mean, on so many levels. I think 10 Candles. First of all, Jeremy, have you played 10 Candles?
I have not. I would like to. I've heard a lot about it. I'm like
Agatha. So here's the
play
pitch. Here's the pitch. So
It's like the not pandemic game.
Yeah,
that's a fact.
Yeah. Yes, very true. But really quick for the audience as well as Jeremy, 10 Candles is a game where you are told up front that you're going to die. Your character that you build is going to die. You light 10 tea light candles, and that is kind of like your clock for the game. They're physical candles, which is part of the experience. You write down on some index cards of like what your qualities and like values and like virtues are. But as you kind of go through it, the overwhelming pressure of the darkness is out there, and it's always trying to stop you. It's always going to be there. And what's really nice is the mechanic is the characters start with a pool of die, and as you roll this pool as player characters, every once in a while, like a little bit of that gets chipped away and gets added to the GM. And as the game goes on, you lose more and more of your control of the situation, and it becomes harder and harder to actually do things you want to do to survive, knowing that you're going to die at the end. And you can burn away some of your attributes by physically burning them in the candles and throwing them into the center of the ceramic table so it doesn't burn down your house. But you burn away your pieces of you, and then the GM gets more and more power until finally get to the end where the candles are all out, and that is the end of the game, and you stop and you just you stop. And it's wonderful.
The thing with 10 Candles that's also really great is that, one, you aren't the only person who makes your character. The people to the left and right of you make your character. The second thing that's interesting is that 10 Candles discourages you from taking breaks. Because it's got
they take away that valve, eh?
Yeah, it's got a rule where if, say, you get up to go to the bathroom and you cause a little breeze that puts out a candle, well, that candle's out. And you just fucked everyone. It's really great game to play. Steve and Agatha, you've been to my place. When we played here, at night, turn down every single light, and it's just the candles.
Oh, that's terrifying.
It's phenomenal. It's actually my partner's favorite TTRPG is 10 Candles.
Nice.
So if you want like a single player version of that, Daniel, since you're getting into single player TTRPGs, that moment where we both geeked out over those indie Castlevania TTRPGs.
I bought them all.
Yeah, so Escape from Demon Castle Dracula is the single player one, where you have, I believe, I've never only skimmed through it, I believe it has candles as well, and the candles also represent your life force, which is appropriate because in the Castlevania games you go around whipping candles, and that's like a single player variant of it.
Yeah.
Nice. So I feel like in terms of like TTRPGs and like things that would be put under the horror genre, I feel like it's just divided into two kinds in my mind. One kind is a kind where you are explicitly informed that you cannot survive, and the other one is the one where you have the chance or like it's much more about you trying to overcome obstacles, if that. Yeah, so for me, like 10 Candles and then Trophy is a game that I played like back when it was still playtesting, and that game is really fun too, but it also is one of the ones where I remember the GM at the beginning before running it was like, okay, this is a horror game and you're probably all gonna die or go crazy at the end. Like the forest, it was set in a forest, that specific game, like the forest is gonna take over your mind, so this is the game that we're playing. We were all like, yes.
Is this Trophy from the Gauntlet?
Yeah, Trophy Gold.
Sweet.
Yeah.
I'll share it in the chat.
Yeah, so I feel like those two, and then also the Wretched and Alone games, so including the Wretched and all of its other variations, those are like games where it's like you're kind of playing it with the expectation that you will fail in whatever endeavor that you are fictionally taking on. And then I feel like Dread as well, though I haven't played that much Dread, so I don't know how the mechanics would really turn out. I'm so distracted by Daniel.
Sorry.
Stroking the book
Valid.
and kissing it.
I love Dread. Like, if we were ever to do an Asians Represent do a horror story live, it would be done with giant Jenga.
Sure. Yeah, I'm down. I've been doing a lot of Jenga gymnastics because I've been playing so many Wretched and Alone games, but I'm still very bad at it. And then like I feel like on the other end is basically like the Call of Cthulhu or Trail of Cthulhu, those kind of games. And I think Sleepaway by Jay Dragon, I'm not really sure if that one is which category it falls in, but that one is also like you play like a bunch of kids at like a summer camp, and then you collectively come up with like this horror and stuff. I think that game is GM-less. I don't remember the details, but that game seems very cool too, and it's also like set in that same kind of like cosmic horror, maybe like kind of like Stranger Things sort of category of where you want to place the genre. But yeah, so I feel like that's how I would define it. And then like also the kind where you feel like you can overcome things is maybe like what is the horror setting in D&D?
Ravenloft.
Thank you. That.
Yeah.
So I think
No, go ahead.
So I feel like those are like basically how I would define it differently. So in terms of like maybe what you want to get out of the game, then I would think about it like, do you want to feel that like helplessness and then like really like engage with those emotions? Then play these games. But then do you want to like engage with kind of like the genre tropes, but not feel so helpless and powerless, then play the other games that like in the other category.
Maybe we should talk about that, because I see, Steve, I saw you, and I made a mental note of this. I saw you leave a comment in the Twitch chat, and you said, if you're playing a horror, and it was like, and I was gonna say this, and you're right. You said if you're doing horror in D&D, you're not playing D&D, or you're not playing D&D right. You said something like that, and you know what? I honestly believe that, especially with 5th edition.
I mean, if you go back to my definition of horror, sorry, Jeremy, I'll say this piece and then Jeremy.
Go ahead. It's totally fine.
Horror for me is about giving up your agency. It's about having control and then losing it. But I think D&D really wants the players to always have control. Like, it's a game built on the power fantasy, which is totally valid. Like, I'm not going to just be I'm not going to dump on that. Yeah. And you know, horror is about losing that control, but D&D wants you to always kind of have it. And then you have, if you're trying to do horror in D&D, you're basically trying to live in this space where the players both have agency, but also you're asking them to give it up. And I think if the players truly just give up their agency, that's not really D&D anymore, which is not a bad thing. It doesn't mean D&D's bad. It just means that you've transitioned into like a different genre. And I think that's like actually kind of beautiful. Jeremy, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Ravenloft. When I started playing D&D, I instantly gravitated towards that setting and just started digging through like 2nd edition lore and stuff like that. And I agree. D&D, particularly 5th edition, I have Curse of Strahd right here. The update of Ravenloft for 5th edition is very much, you know, D&D is a power fantasy, and D&D is a game where even though Strahd is a high-level character who could, you know, cream a group of low-level adventurers, D&D to me is like Devil May Cry, where you are like Dante and you're in these horrific environments, but you're in a character action game, and you're never really that scared. I mean, initially Devil May Cry 1 and 2, it's a freaky atmosphere, and Devil May Cry originally started as a blueprint for Resident Evil 4 before they decided to revamp Resident Evil 4 as Leon Kennedy suplexing cultists. Yep. And if you just listen to the Devil May Cry 1 soundtrack on YouTube, it sounds very surreal and atmospheric and frightening. And then the metal kicks in, and then, you know, you're fighting against demons. So even though I think you can investigate horror themes in a D&D game, in Curse of Strahd, I mean, the whole character of Strahd, he's basically a male abuser. And you can really kind of investigate that concept with safety tools, of course, but investigate what makes him villainous and whether or not he can be redeemed in the course of a game. And that can be interesting, but ultimately your players are never going to really quiver in fear. Now, you mentioned Call of Cthulhu, Agatha. You know, that's another mainstream horror game. I have Call of Cthulhu, Mansions of Madness here. I just got it in the mail today. I have a shitload of books like right next to me. But this is, you know, it's a mainstream game. It is a horror game, but it's a little bit different from, you know, D&D's Devil May Cry, in that this is more like Silent Hill, whereas you're not really an uber powerful character. You're very weak. And the goal is to survive with limited resources. And that's what actually drew me to Call of Cthulhu, and why I've probably played it so much over the last couple of years. The whole idea of, you're not this superpowered adventurer. You know, there is a likely chance that your character will die, especially when encountering these horrors that totally outclass him or her. But if you can survive, if you can make it through the night and learn from experience, you will gradually become a more hardened character. And Call of Cthulhu has its problems too. It deals with, you know, the idea of your character becoming more hardened by their psyche getting more and more fractured, and doesn't have the best representation of mental health. But I think that is kind of the difference that we're talking about here. You have Devil May Cry and Silent Hill, and that, you know, put in video game terms, is kind of why it is difficult to do horror, as in lack of agency horror, with D&D. Now, I agree it can be done, but you're kind of twisting things a little bit. And actually, one of the main things I see people using D&D for horror is like strip down your resources, make the characters just like a single level and make it grittier. And that's not really what D&D necessarily excels with, particularly 5th edition. Like I think there are other RPGs like Shadow of the Demon Lord, like Zweihander, that are better. But it can be done. And actually, I'm probably going to end up doing something like that in a couple weeks, because I ordered the on eBay, I ordered the original version of Ravenloft from AD&D, and I'm basically running a 5th edition conversion of that, where it's just the characters at 5th level and limited resources. And I think then you can bring forth some of that atmosphere of, will we survive this? But not in a campaign where you go from like level 1 to level 12 and cream straw it in like three rounds.
I have one tip for that, and I've learned that from experience being a player. Is if you're gonna run the, because I have a copy of it, and we did it in Pathfinder. Take away certain things, because
absolutely
many of the original puzzles and things that you had to solve were just like modern D&D would you just breeze through it.
Totally.
I think that,
but you can before I finish, there's just one thing with D&D. I think, going back to what we've been talking about, you can't really emulate that feeling of helplessness and lack of agency, but you can play with the atmosphere of horror. And I think it can be useful for a group of players who are uncomfortable with jumping into something like Bluebeard's Bride or even Call of Cthulhu, to experiment with that horror atmosphere in a game of D&D, where it feels perhaps a little bit safer, because you are ultimately going to end up devil may crying, these enemies. That's my take there.
Yeah, and I think aside from like scaling power in D&D, one of the things that D&D lacks that games like Call of Cthulhu and like Delta Green have are mechanics built into it that create that tension. D&D doesn't have a tracker for things like sanity, fear, right? Nor are there tools that
or like stress,
right? There are no, like another one, like there are like complex ways to do it and really simple ways to do it, right? Like a really simple way is the way they do it in Lady Blackbird. Lady Blackbird, when you get a condition, you narratively circle whichever condition you think works for you, right? And then you're supposed to role play off of that. In games like Delta Green, like our server knows that like I went through 4 Delta Green characters in 2020, just because you're powerless, even though you're like an archaeologist or a military operator. You're powerless because of the game mechanics. And the game does a really great job of telling the GM when to subject players to sanity loss, and the game mechanically responds by taking away your agency when you hit a breaking point. So I think D&D fails in that it doesn't have mechanics for that. Where I think D&D succeeds is that there's plenty of flavor. There is plenty of, like you said, Jeremy, plenty of really interesting stuff in the D&D world that you can explore with modification or even with another system.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, you can do, once again, you can do Devil May Cry in D&D. You can do Castlevania easily. Like most of my Ravenloft campaigns are inspired by Castlevania, and you can investigate those themes, I think. But you can't really do like Silent Hill or Resident Evil. Maybe the later Resident Evils you can do. Probably not the first.
You could do Resident Evil 6.
Yes, absolutely.
You could do Resident Evil 6, and it's just the Chris campaign.
Yes,
that's D&D.
I want to investigate specifically Bluebeard's Bride. So, have any of you played it?
I am fascinated by this game, and
I have only read it.
Yeah, I want to play it. I've been reading it. I just don't know when I'll be able to.
I'm going to add that I'm at the camp that I would love to read it, but I don't think I will want to play it.
Yeah. I would only play it with the right people. It is not the kind of game that I would ever play at a con. It is like the game that I will play with people that I deeply trust.
So let's talk briefly about the premise of Bluebeard's Bride, and also because I want to dive into a thing that analog tabletop role-playing games can provide that I don't think any other medium can, which I think is encapsulated really well, specifically within Bluebeard's Bride. So what is the premise? I haven't read it in a long time. So.
Oh yeah. So Bluebeard's Bride is a game where all of the players occupy a part of the bride's psyche as she explores the mysteries of this manor. But it deals with pretty like explicit themes of like abuse in it. So yeah, you are all the players are playing a single character. It's really interesting, but I think for me, the themes are just like, this is something that I think Bluebeard's Bride kind of falls into the camp of, this makes me feel uncomfortable because it feels too real.
Right.
And much of the discomfort comes with the anxiety of playing it with people who I may not trust. Like,
Right.
I could deal with these themes, but to deal with these themes with a table full of strangers is terrifying to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like there's something about a tabletop role-playing game, especially within this context where all of the players are actively like providing the horror, you know, that this character that has to encounter, and it is the most immersive and like active way to engage with horror, where you're not just experiencing it, but you're creating it for yourself, for this character. And it's one of those games that is very like, yeah, like you either, I think you can, a lot, it's not for a lot of people, because for a lot of people they don't want to engage with these themes, which is understandable. But it's also like, if you play it, like, you are both oppressing and feeling oppressed. You are feeling that oppression in a way that you just can't experience really, like from watching a movie or from reading like a book or something, right? So I feel like that is the really powerful part of like TTRPGs, especially when it comes to horror, for example, like evoking an emotion or like learning, I guess, about themes or experiences. And Bluebeard's Bride does that so well. And I feel like a lot of other horror games too, where it's like, there's something about when you're in a game and the people around you are scared, that makes you scared too.
Yeah, it's a shared experience, right? It's an you're actively engaging in horrific themes, which is what makes it interesting.
You're bringing your own personal brand of horror to the table,
Yeah.
and everyone else is doing the same thing, and together you create a shared horror, which is very intimate, and also really heavy.
That said, if you're new to the wrap up, please go watch 2 episodes ago and watch the episode on bleed.
Yes, and I was actually going to mention that bleed can really, really occur in that type of situation.
Yeah. And
the other thing I wanted to add was that because I've been talking about control all the time, I think horror needs a release in it. And actually, one of the releases that I find when interacting with horror is the release of other people rise to the occasion and like either share through empathy or share through courage, and sometimes both. A way to kind of help relieve the tension that the horrific events begin to perpetuate. So for me, like a way to like rise and fall out of horror is actually with people who either share the experience and like validate my experience and help me like understand that I'm not truly alone in these horrible moments, or depending on like how much power fantasy is in there, tell me that, you know, together as a unit, together as a family, we find ourselves through to the end. We find the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, and I think bouncing off of that, that's a big thing that drew me to horror in 2014 when I really started diving into the genre. First by, you know, Stephen King books, then horror video games, and then movies, and finally TTRPGs. That idea of, you know, people, that idea of solidarity in the darkness, and realizing that here are some themes that have frightened me all of my life, like just using the fact that I read It, which is actually technically a book about growing up and, you know, dealing with childhood trauma. That concept, you know, being explored through this genre fiction was what really attracted to me to horror after years of avoiding the concept. And I think, yeah, I think as we've been talking about, tabletop RPGs are this powerful venue for really doing that if you so desire.
And I found that solo games.
Mm-hmm.
I want to bring this to something that like Agatha's like, Agatha's jam, right? And I feel like solo games do something special in that they allow you to, one of the things I talked about with Bluebeard's Bride was like I found extreme discomfort not so much in the material itself, but in exploring this material with others, right? And the cool thing that I found about solo games is that they not only let you do that on your own terms and alone, but they let you tell stories that might be more difficult to tell with a group. One of the things that I like about horror are like there are these like little bits that kind of appear in horror TV shows, movies, or games that I would just love to like explore on my own. For instance, there is a series on Sci-Fi called Channel Zero. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Channel Zero. But in the first season of Channel Zero, it's like it's all right. But in the first season of Channel Zero, there was a thing that really got me, and I loved it. And it was a kid made entirely of teeth. Everything was teeth. And that's the kind of shit I love, right? And, kids made entirely of teeth. And there's a sole protagonist of the first season of Channel Zero. And I would love to explore that in, a narrative game. I found that games like The Wretched are perfect for that, right? Like when you love Alien, like Alien is another great example, right? You could go two routes. You can go the more Devil May Cry with Aliens, or you could go, hardcore horror with Alien. The first two Alien movies are like, they kind of contrast against each other because they're very two different kinds of horror. One lends itself really well to a group game, and that's the second Aliens movie because, you've got, Ripley, and then you've got all the Marines, and then you got Bishop and things like that. But in the first one, it's mostly just Ripley. And it's the same kind of horror that's, in Alien Isolation, that game with the punishingly difficult AI. And I found The Wretched, when I was playing it, was just this game-changing experience. And like,
have you ever? Go ahead.
No, and I just want to hear Agatha talk more about solo games so I can learn more about them.
The thing is, I'm also very new to solo games. But before that, Jeremy, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, have you guys ever played the Skeletons?
What's that?
It's look it up. It can be played solo with a group, but basically you play decrepit skeletons rotting in a cavern, and the goal of the game is to visualize and interpret how they ended up there, what they were like in life, and how they cope with the existential dread of being just immortalized in rock as time changes around them. It can be played solo as a journaling experience, and when I did it, I basically came up with this narrative that these were skeletons that had been in some kind of war, and over time they had seen civilizations and nations fall, and tomb robbers come into the caves, and those tomb robbers die in front of them. And it was really, you're encouraged, like with each passing, I think, phase of the game, you're encouraged to set a timer and like sit in the dark and play this MP3 file of like cavernous sounds and water dripping to just visualize what it's like to be a rotting skeleton.
And of course, this is a Jason Morningstar game.
Yeah, that was my experience playing it.
I was gonna ask if it was the Jason Morningstar.
It's Jason Morningstar. That's my experience playing it solo. Playing with a group, I played it with another friend of mine. It just went completely bonkers because we took that energy and made it something really ridiculous, where we were skeletons chained to an asteroid in space, and like freaking like Lobo on his space motorcycle had killed us and chained us there. And so it went completely the opposite direction, massively bonkers, comedic. But yeah, you can have your cake and eat it too. That's a game, can be played solo and with friends. If you have the right group, it can be a case in existential dread. And I suppose if you have the right group, it can be a completely funny experience as well.
You could hack that into being I know Steve, you just finished Star Wars Rebels, that
Yeah,
inventory droid who finally gets his piece when he's released into space on his
pretty
own,
much.
and
Yeah.
then they just like scoop him back up. It's like, no.
After playing
That
that version with my friend, all I could think of was like the theme song of Skeleton Warriors, that old cartoon from like the 90s in my head. And yeah,
that is one of my like we've been talking about, but like everyone has like a fear where like it gets too much, where like that particular piece, I'm not gonna say triggers, but definitely resonates in such a way that you just need to like come back to reality and like reground yourself and like figure out what your foundation is, look at your texts, that kind of stuff, like check Twitter, like that kind of stuff. And actually that moment in Rebels where there's a droid who's lost in space and finds peace made me feel so small. It made me feel so helpless that I had to turn off. I was like, I can't watch this anymore, because even though that has like a happy ending, the happy ending wasn't truly happy. And I just had to sit in my emotions for a little bit. I turn off the series and like decompress and things like that. But like that particular moment was a horrific moment in a series which generally doesn't do horror and is for children. And like, what a beautiful like moment for me to have on my own, personally, in this like this our world.
It's like when like children's series unintentionally do something that's like really dark.
it's like
Or
Watership Down.
or I was gonna say like that one episode of Gargoyles. If you know the one episode that should not have been on TV that scarred every kid, the
I
gun
really need
safety.
to watch. I
the
really
gun,
need to
the
watch
gun,
Gargoyles.
the gun safety episode of Gargoyles.
I never watched it.
I really
I
want to
don't
watch
know.
it.
It's
A,
true.
a
So
lot
good.
of Magic School Bus.
Not the
I mean,
new one.
it's
Not the new
Powerpuff
one.
Girls.
Powerpuff Girls also has a lot of
I got
like really
I got
yeah. I feel you.
horrified by one episode where they like all traveled to the future by accident.
Yep.
And everything was like horrible. Oh my gosh. I was so upset.
For me, and like to like Powerpuff Girls, where they introduced Bunny, who's the fourth Powerpuff Girl. That is, to me, is the most tragic, upsetting episode of any kid show I've ever seen. Bunny is the fourth Powerpuff Girl who is built out of materials that aren't perfect, and like she comes into being, and she's by all means she's like bigger than them, and like she has a humpback, and like she doesn't speak as eloquently as them, and she looks conventionally ugly, and everyone hates her, but the Powerpuff Girls love her, and she decides that her life is less valuable than theirs, and she dies at the end of the episode, and the Powerpuff Girls have no choice but to be like, we loved you so much and you're gone now, and we have to move on with our lives. And like, that's a kid's show. Like,
Yep.
that's real rough.
Yep.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah. But speaking of solo games, I
Yeah.
guess going back to what
Sorry.
Wait.
Yeah. Sorry,
No,
yeah, I'm
dude,
getting-
well, that's why. That's what makes. I think that's what makes the wrap up special. You know, we talk about what we want to talk about.
Yeah, but I agree, Daniel, about solo games and how and I think Jeremy, you kind of touched on that too with talking about skeletons. There's like a meditative quality to it because you're taking it at your own pace, and the solitude where you have to like sit there with your thoughts is very interesting. I do like the Wretched and Alone games because it's just very tactile. Actually, that's a huge part of why I like it. Like you have a Jenga tower, you have cards, you have dice, and you have to journal, or like do like an audio recording. There's a lot of elements to kind of like take me into the situation of this game. One of the games that I played was called Bloom, and that's the one where you are you're like a part of like an all-girls school on this island, and then there's this like disease that takes over, and then you start like it starts manifesting in like painful mutations on your body, or it kills you, and then you're like trying to survive that basically, and then you've been quarantined from the outside by the military. I'm pretty sure it's inspired by a book.
Like Lord of the Flies mixed with like
Not Lord of the
Annihilation.
Flies. There was a recent book that came out that was that specific premise. It's called Something Girls. And the cover looks really cool. It looks like a girl, but then like it looks like she's just like cut up into ribbons kind of. Anyway, I really like that one because that one had a lot of body horror. Like one of uh it the way that the game works with all of these Retro Alone games is that you basically you get cues for like depending on
Wilder
what cards you
Girls.
draw. Sorry?
Wilder Girls.
Yes, thank you. It's so you whatever card you draw, you look at the suit and you look at the number and then you match it to whatever like writing prompt basically is in the game. And like one of the suits is literally like things happening to your body. And I really like body horror, turns out. So I yeah, thanks. All the teeth. I feel like it really gave me the time to like think about like, okay, what would I find scary in this situation? And then I started writing it out. And it was just it's just a very focused and well, I already said meditative kind of state that you go into. And with the Wretched, it's even cooler because they like have all these music files too that came with, I guess the Kickstarter was successful, so then it had all of these different things that you can listen to and feel scared.
Yeah, what was that the one with the girls called again?
Bloom. And that one is a pay what you can, pay what you want.
I will
One as
find
well.
it and try.
Is it the one for Mothership?
No, that's a different one. Bloom
different?
by Litza Bronwyn. I found it.
Let's,
Yes.
So Daniel, while you find that, one question that I had and I really wanted to explore, maybe with the little bit of time we have left, is we've talked about kind of like horror, what it means. We talked about examples of horror, but like what value do you get out of interacting with these horror stories? Like, why should people seek out horror narratives?
That's good. I don't think there's one right answer. I think entertainment is a very valid answer.
Mhm.
I think a great one. I mean, for me, is like to. I always think horror is like an interesting way to, especially horror games and TTRPGs, really interesting way as an exercise to apply my knowledge of science and history.
Yeah. No, I think
that's
that's
interesting.
That's really cool because like it's a way to like regain control. Because really, like, what is science but like an understanding, which is a type of control, right?
Yeah.
And I'm really pushing my control narrative on horror, but but I think it really makes sense there, and I think it's really really interesting.
I want to know about the rest of the folks. Why? What do you think? Like, to Steve's question.
I find that for me, as somebody who's grappled with anxiety and has felt very fearful at times in his life, and starting from when I was frightened of vampires as a kid, and just couldn't go to sleep at night, I found that once I chose to explore horror and all the things that come with it, it was, as Steve said, kind of a way of investigating these concepts that had frightened me in almost like a I guess, I'm not sure if safe space is the right word, but almost in a controlled manner where I was separate from the element that caused me fear, but at the same time I was engaging with it, and I could choose to step away if I wanted to. And I found that the more I engaged with horror media, particularly horror media that deals with themes that have frightened me throughout my life, themes of like growing up, themes of abandonment, themes of, existential dread, I found myself gaining more perspective, perhaps feeling a little bit desensitized in some ways, but just generally getting a lot out of the experience. So for me, horror is kind of therapeutic in that way, in that if you choose to investigate these concepts, you can get certain, I don't know, certain rewards for your, for your own mental benefit that I think will help you later on in life. That's my take on it.
How about you, Agatha?
I agree about the therapeutic, and I also feel like I agree about the entertainment as well. Like you play it for the thrills. It's like why you go to the haunted houses or amusement parks, or go to watch horror movies, right? I think. I don't know. I don't watch horror movies. I assume that's what the motivation is, but you do it for the thrills, and then you do it to like explore about yourself. I feel like those I think are the two big things. And then a third thing is like maybe sometimes you want to, it's like what they say about like tragedies, going to watch tragedies, right? Like you go to experience it, and then there's the, what's the word? Oh no. There's the emotional release of having experienced it, but
Oh, I
what's the
know
word?
exactly what you're talking about. There's a word
Yeah.
for this. Oh
Yeah.
no.
We've got time. We've got like 12 minutes.
Catharsis? I think catharsis.
Catharsis.
Is close.
Catharsis?
Yes. Is it catharsis?
That's right.
Okay.
Oh my
you.
gosh,
Thank-
Steve.
thank-
I mean,
thank you, Monte.
Monty put it in the chat, so it's Catharsis. If Monty put
Yeah.
it there, it's got to be right.
Yeah, so catharsis, yeah, where it's like you feel, especially with those like the more hopeless or like existential dread ones, like you experience it, you get all the way to the end, and then it's bleak, and then you like take a moment to like rest in that, and then afterwards you feel that sense of catharsis. You are back into like normal life, and that is sometimes like it helps when you already feel anxiety in real life, and then you're like, the most anxious, I have died, but now I'm alive again. So
Well, yeah, it says you could turn it off.
Yes.
It's over. It as an end.
yes, so it's like what Jeremy said, where it's like this has a beginning and end, and there's like a high degree of control over it, so then you can experience all of that you fear and then step away.
I also like to go with that. You're talking about anxiety and things like that. I think there's also like an art to horror that's really great to experience, and it's like horror is one of those genres that's unique in how many emotions it tries to draw out of you, right? That anxiety, the revulsion, right? And then even the laughs too, right? You watch like a movie like, Shaun of the Dead, and it's very much a comedy. It's like a horror comedy. Or you watch a movie like one of my favorite horror movies is Slither by James Gunn. And that movie's got like, it's got everything I love. It's got like science, it's got aliens, it's got body horror, it's got Nathan Fillion, and it also it's got this like interesting comedic storytelling. And then you look to movies like Jeremy, I hope you've seen this one. Have you ever seen Brain Dead?
I have not seen Brain Dead. I should.
What?
Yeah.
So
I should
Agatha,
watch
Steve,
Brain
have you two seen Brain Dead? So I think
No,
it was really
never even heard of it.
Oh, okay. In the early '90s, Peter
Yeah.
Jackson of Lord
Peter
of the Rings
Jackson's one
fame,
of Peter Jackson's films.
he made one of the goriest zombie movies ever made.
I think I've seen clips of it.
Maybe,
Actually, I think
many
I've
people
seen
have
it.
seen clips.
Check this out. I have not seen Brain Dead, but I'm Googling it now. And the VHS cover of Brain Dead was one that specifically freaked me out walking through Blockbuster as a kid. I still remember.
Amazing.
It's a
Beautiful.
fantastic
Nature's
movie.
healing.
But
Yeah.
but like I think what's really cool about horror movies and games, and then like games both digital and analog, is the ways in which the good ones draw those emotions out of you, right? The use of the Jenga tower in Dread or Wretched games, the use of the cards in Wretched games, or even like very expertly the candles in 10 Candles. How you could take a simple thing like a candle or a block tower and turn it into a tool that just pulls all of these emotions out of you. And that's why I think, people who are able to run horror games are, very, very like masterful storytellers. Or the people who are able to make very low budget horror movies are, masterful at that craft. And I think that's another part of the horror experience, and it's watching that.
Mhm.
And it's like something that I'm doing now, that I'm trying to write my own Wretched game. And Agatha, I know you're trying to use Wretched's mechanics, but you said maybe you're not doing horror with it.
I mean, it depends on who you're talking to. But wait, okay, what is your premise? And then I will
Okay.
also say my premise.
So I kind of have this this universe that I'm writing. It's my Bureau of Paranatural Survey thing, and I'm writing like a crunchier game that now I'm reformatting my first draft to use actually the mothership system. But after reading and playing The Wretched and a whole bunch of other ones, I was like, I want to make my own. And so I'm writing one about an agent, a member of a bureau task force that is sent to an idyllic small town torn apart by an esoteric cult. And this cult has basically, this cult leader has essentially created a monstrous congregation, and your team is picked apart and you are cut off from the outside world. You have taken the artifact, the source of this cult's power, and they are hunting you.
Oh, that's so good.
And so for me, what I'm doing right now is, you have all 4 suits in the card deck, and I'm exploring very slowly, because I want this to be very purposeful, what each suit is. Is it the artifact? Because I want the players to think, well, what is the artifact? What form does it take? What does it say to you?
Yeah, it are you gonna make one of the suits like how it might corrupt?
Yeah, how it corrupts you, and you could die that way.
Yeah.
And you could, or you can join the congregation.
Yeah.
There's like the town. What are your encounters with the town? Do you encounter survivors? What things that have been done by this cult?
Yep.
How have these things affected you? Have they set up these like grotesque tableaus of corpses? Have they? Sorry, I don't know why that was in my mind. Sorry.
I love that was like.
I know that was the first thing. That was the first thing. Like
Tableaus.
have they set something up like that? How have they cut you off from the outside world?
Yeah.
Are electronics not working? Has your reliance on technology failed you? And so that's kind of what I've been exploring with this game. It's this failed operation,
Yep.
a cult, and its cursed or transformed congregation are hunting you.
Right. Do you want to make it like Silent Hill and have one of the suits be like your memories and things like that? Or
yeah, and it's like your memories of your
got it.
squad, right?
Yeah.
So like I was
that's
inspired by, I guess we could say, like, actually three very specific things. First one was a couple panels, but a specific story arc in the BPRD, in the Plague of Frogs. They go to this small town and there's this monstrous congregation. Another one is The Crazies, another fantastic movie if you're a zombie fan. The Crazies was a 1973 movie written by and directed by George A. Romero, but they remade it in 2010 with my boy Timothy Olyphant. I love Timothy Olyphant.
I see.
But it's basically about a town that gets corrupted by a bioweapon that has it tainted their water, and it turns everyone violent. It's just about the sheriff trying to survive with his pregnant wife. And the last one was SCP Overlord, which was a short film that I really love. But Agatha, I want to know about yours.
Okay, so the one that I had an idea for is you have been set up for a blind date by your mom or aunt.
Oh God.
Oh my
God.
So that's horror, right? But I'm also struggling with the suits. Like, I don't really know. I don't know if I want to include like a supernatural element to it. Would that be too funny? I don't know. Like, but one of them is definitely your mom. Or aunt. I don't know. So I'm kind of yeah. So that's one, and then one of them is yourself, and I guess one of them would be the blind date, and then I don't know what is the last suit. But yeah, it's like
Your
that's the
grandma, your
situation.
grandparents.
Jima.
Oh, I that
Ooh.
that brought out some like real memories.
Yeah.
That's a horror game if I'm playing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like that actually has a lot of potential to be horrifying or cathartic, depending on what happens. So
So that's actually a thought I've been like mulling over the course of the hour and a half we've talked about, which is there's a privilege element to horror, and the catharsis actually plays very closely to your experience, your lived experiences, which is, of course, is married to your privileges. And the horror that an individual experiences, I think, is very tied to the privileges that they've had and the privileges they haven't had. So, Agatha, to your kind of story here, the idea of being set up by someone, by Daniel's reaction, and even my reaction, um, is very like cultural. I think there's like
yeah.
element of it that is very like specific to specific people, and not everyone can understand that.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually quite beautiful. And I think that's something worth examining, because what is horrific to someone, horrible and terrific to someone, is both, it can resonate with one group, and for another group, doesn't really hit. It just feels like, oh, scary. And that's not exactly the emotional response a creator is looking for. And I find that so fascinating.
Yeah. I feel like the tone that I'm thinking of is definitely the kind of like you're telling it as a funny story to your friends, but it's also horrifying.
Yeah.
But you're using humor to kind of like process it, because otherwise it's like, jeez.
Yeah. That's why I find that portmanteau of horrific to be so wonderful, because it's a portmanteau of horror, like the terror, and terrific, the pleasure of it. And I think that really like encapsulates kind of like the horror genre experience of both the fear and the dread and the loneliness and like the other negativity, combined with also the positivity, the terrific, the light at the end of the tunnel. And that is a tension that I think is both personal to me, but also I think resonates with a lot of audiences out there. Otherwise, we wouldn't see things like Train to Busan. We wouldn't see things like Dawn of the Dead, things like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, I mean, you talked about at the beginning of the stream, you talked about Alive, that movie. And I think Alive really captures all of that, right? That really relatable loneliness in a world where we're so connected by technology, and then that release at the end.
Yeah. It became a power fantasy at the end. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to do any spoilers, but like at the end, the protagonist finds strength and community to overcome the oppressive force that they thought they couldn't control. And like, mwah. I don't think it's super realistic, but like it felt cathartic, Agatha, to like kind of the stuff we're talking about. And like it feels good to like engage with that kind of media. And I like it. And I think people should watch it too, because it's great.
Yeah, perhaps we will watch it for the wrap up unplugged on the server one day.